Well, welcome back, everyone, to episode 15 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Today we are beginning to look at Oppenheim's presentation of Mesopotamian religion. So we're going to first ask the question, what is Mesopotamian religion and can we write one? And we're going to look at the nature of our evidence, both archaeological and textual. So, he begins this section of Mesopotamian religion with the title, Why a Mesopotamian Religion Should Not Be Written, which is an interesting way to write the opening of a section on Mesopotamian religion in a survey of Mesopotamian culture and history. His argument is that the nature of the evidence that we have, both archaeological and textual, is not only incomplete, but is difficult, if not impossible, to correctly interpret. Now, before I continue, I'm going to present Oppenheim's view, his chapter, which was debated around the time that it was presented, and I'm going to summarize the position of a counterposition by Botereau in his assessment of Oppenheim's statements about why a Mesopotamian religion should not be written. So I don't want you to think that this went unchallenged, and many people did not agree with him. But I think it is important to present, even if he's being a little bit hyperbolic or a little extreme, maybe. It is very important to understand the things that we need to be careful about when we think about history writing in general and writing about religion as a diachronic whole in specific. So there is the separation that he argues for, and of course it's there, by time and cultural situation or cultural norms. So, we have different cultural context, and we're talking about things that happened anywhere from 3,000 to 2,000 to 5,000 years ago. So, and everything in between. So this is a long time ago in a very different cultural setting. So what is the nature of our evidence? Well, he cites archaeological evidence, buildings and structures, so temples in particular, and the shrines that are involved with those, cultic objects that are found not only in those religious contexts, but in residential contexts, so images, little amulets and charms, those sorts of things. And also iconography, so iconography that we see in reliefs or cylinder seals. These are all things that we can interpret to try to get closer to Mesopotamian religion. The problem is that it's very difficult to understand what those things mean outside of specific information that tells you what those things mean. So he gives the example of a modern-day cathedral. And if you, 2,000 years from now, were to walk into a cathedral, let's say in Germany, and you were to see the iconography, you were to see the different, the tables and the benches and the statuettes and, the candles and all these other things that you might see there in the archaeological record, having no direct knowledge of that religious context, it would be very difficult to ascertain what is it that, for example, these stained glass windows mean. What does this indicate? So they would have to rely on things like written textual evidence to describe what those things mean. And outside of that, it's difficult to get further along than a general understanding of this is a religious place, this is where they would have done sacrifice, or in other words, being very precise is difficult, as it would be for an archaeologist 2,000 years from now. So we can identify, he argues, what the general functions were, but not the specifics. And that's important to remember. His quote here, I think, sums it up pretty well. The monuments of a forgotten cult, of a cult we know only through a few written documents, can reveal, even if perfectly preserved, only a fraction, a dim reflection of the cultic activities which they served. And so again, while that might be a touch extreme, it's very important to remember this principle that you can't just see something and say, well, we do it this way now, so that must have been the way they did it then. And you can't make those kinds of connections and assume that you know without direct evidence what something was used for. You have to be very careful. More clear are the textual remains that we have, but even these are problematic. So he cites three different types of textual evidence that we can use to get at religious context. One is one of the prayers. So they reveal that the worshiper, one of the things that you can tell from the prayers, and again, this is imperfect in its reflection, but what he seems to be able to ascertain is that they reveal that the worshiper was not greatly affected by the religion, particularly with respect to doing things with his belongings or with his time. In other words, when we think about religion today, there's this great call to sacrifice, to give up things personally in order to, serve God or to serve the religion. And this did not seem to be the case, as indicated by the individual prayers for the Mesopotamian. There are mythological texts, and he has a quote that I thought was appropriate to cite. All these works, which we are wont to call mythological, should be studied by the literary critic and by the historian of religion. And this is difficult. I think this is a difficult pill to swallow for those involved in theological studies. What we want to do is be able to pick up the the mythological text, the religious text, the thing that tells the story about the gods, and be able to just write the Mesopotamian religion based on it. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. We can't just do that. Literary criticism is required, for example, to try and determine what the text is doing, and this is very important when we think about Mesopotamian mythological texts, because they're doing different things with these mythologies, and trying to ascertain what those things are is very important, and he argues is the job of the literary critic much more so than the religious historian. Finally, the ritual texts. Now, these are much closer to getting at what the actual ritual was, because these are texts that describe what the ritual looked like and what acts were to be performed during the ritual and so forth. But these are not set in stone. So he, without going into great detail here, he cites the recovering of the kettle drum ritual, and we have a video, a daily data video about this. So you can click on that and get more detail on the kettle drum recovering. But this was a very important ritual, and we have texts both from the Neo-Assyrian period, so maybe the 8th, 7th century, and we have one from the Seleucid period in Uruk. And the difference in time there, we have ritual texts from both periods, and while there are many, many similarities, there are also some differences, and he cites those differences to show that even the same ritual that within a millennium or less, within 500 years or so, can really develop. And so we can't just assume that if a ritual was done in the early second millennium, that when we see it in the first millennium, that it's the same ritual. It may be, but there may be differences, and we have to be very aware of the development that a ritual can take. So, summarizing his introduction to Mesopotamian religion, the nature of the evidence for Mesopotamian religion is problematic, And this is especially because of our separation by time and culture. Archaeological evidence is difficult to interpret with any specificity without accompanying textual data. But even when we have textual data, it must also be interpreted, and there are changes through time that we see even in the textual record. So we have to allow for these things, and we have to be careful not to draw wide-ranging, diachronic, generalizing conclusions or make these types of presentations of Mesopotamian religion. We have to make sure that we are cautious as we try to make general statements about how religion functioned in the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia. Tomorrow, we will begin to look at more details of the religion, and we're going to start by addressing the care and feeding of the gods. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?